reasons for the constant improvement in the quality of baked foods, but she is learning more and more to appreciate the advantages of the economy, convenience, and dependability offered by the baker. Most of us are familiar with the great strides made in the application of scientific principles to industrial problems. We take as commonplace the tremendous advances made in automobiles, communication, aeronautics, electronics, refrigeration, everything from synthetic foods to fanciful luxuries. So often we forget that before these advances could be made, the scientific principles on which they are based had to be understood. Stroboscopic, microscopic, and slow-motion photography have helped to reveal many previously unknown factors. In our effort to understand the principles of cake baking, we found it necessary to develop micro-baking, a new tool of research as applied to baking. There has always been an unknown connected with all baked products, a mysterious period during baking into which we have been unable to probe. Many times, bakers have wished they could see what actually takes place inside a cake or a loaf of bread while it is in the oven, so they could understand why defects develop while their products are being baked. Micro-baking makes it possible for you to see what actually does happen inside a baking product. You can see the causes of many defects. To properly understand this picture, we must forget previous conceptions based on normal powers of vision. Our microscopic world deals with extremely small objects. But remember, what happens under the microscope also happens every day in your bakery. Through the use of the microscope, we have known for a long time how to distinguish the characteristics of the different ingredients used in baking. These are a few grains of sugar, magnified only 6 times. We recognize sugar crystals by their shape. They are always similar in shape, although they may differ in size. Under different conditions of light, sugar looks like this, and we find it easily soluble. A drop of water dissolves it almost on contact. The large crystals take longer to dissolve. We are now approaching a clear solution. A few air bubbles remain, but these bubbles were carried into the solution by the sugar. Sugar does not always remain in a dissolved state. Here, sugar crystals are coming out of solution. Sugar sometimes crystallizes right on the crust of a cake. This surface defect is common to cakes of many types. This cake was allowed to stand in dry atmosphere for an hour before baking. The sugar actually crystallized in the crust, forming thousands of small crystals. There are several remedies, such as more humid baking conditions, more water in the batter, and more salt. Now, let's look at a high-grade cake flour magnified 100 times. Polarized light helps us to see the uniform size of the flour particles, the sharp separateness of individual starch granules. This is cake flour paste made of flour and water. The brown color indicates the amount of protein, which in cake flour is small. By contrast, bread flour paste contains more protein and shows up as a deeper brown. Bread flour is unsuited for cake baking because of the amount and nature of its protein and its coarse granulation. Neither does it have the water and sugar carrying capacity of cake flour. Our third ingredient is shortening. Because shortening is practically colorless, it is difficult to identify under the microscope. For this reason, red dye is added to the shortening, but only for identification purposes. The dye will not color any other portion of the batter. A tiny part of the colored shortening is placed on the glass slide. A cover glass is pressed over it to spread it out thin, so light will penetrate the shortening. A most important value of shortening to cake baking is its ability to entrap and hold air bubbles. The bubbles you see here account for the fluffy appearance of the shortening. The heavy black rims around the bubbles really are not rims at all. The air bubbles are of a spherical shape, and the refraction of light gives an optical illusion, causing the dark outlines. Now we are going to see how cake batter containing our previously studied ingredients looks under the microscope. Let's take our friend, the scientific baker, into our microscopic world to help us learn about cake batter structure. This is the normal cake batter magnified 200 times. Remember, the shortening was dyed red for identification. The shortening is distributed throughout the batter in the form of small lakes, which remain apart from the liquid batter ingredients. Inside the red lakes of shortening is a honeycomb effect caused by the suspended air held in the shortening. There are no air cells in any other portion of the batter. All cake batters containing fats show a similar structure. Increasing the magnification shows the structure of a single area of shortening holding a few air bubbles. These bubbles and the surrounding shortening are not flat like a plate, but round like a ball. In a three-dimensional picture, this would look very much like a bunch of grapes. The shortening particles are suspended in a pasty fluid composed of the flour, milk, and eggs, into which are dissolved the sugar, salt, and baking powder. The size of the shortening particles is most important. Remember them. Another important thing to observe is the structural characteristic of the fluid suspension. In the pasty fluid portion of our batter are millions of individual flour particles. They stand apart from the lakes of shortening. We are now ready for micro baking. We will actually bake a cake under the microscope. This is our little oven. It heats by electricity. Our pan is a glass slide. A rheostat controls the heat, governing with exactness the temperature of our cake baking. The microscope is carefully focused, and we're ready to bake. Here we are in the hitherto unknown world, inside a cake while it is baking, actually looking at the inside story of cake baking. We studied the structure of batters in detail, and now one of the first things we notice is that the structure does not remain constant during the period of baking. Instead, the batter is continuously changing throughout the baking process. To study this more carefully, we'll observe the action in slower motion. When the cake begins to bake, notice first the melting of the fat. Remember, the fat was colored red, and you should be able to follow it throughout the entire baking process. As soon as the fat melts, its entrapped air bubbles are released to the liquid portion of the batter. These air bubbles are then free to move about, and that's exactly what they do. Again, we call attention to the thick rims around the air bubbles. We have already learned that they are optical illusions caused by light refraction. A gradual expansion takes place caused by the rising temperature within the batter and by the development of gas from the baking powder. The gas development makes our air cells expand and push against each other. A baking cake is a system of moving particles. It has to move. Any undue resistance to its movement will cause trouble. Notice the function of the clear red lakes of fat in the lubrication of this movement. As our cake continues to bake, we approach the temperature at which water boils and steam collects inside the bubbles. The steam produces a period of intense pressure inside the cake. The movement of all the particles in the batter is greatly accelerated with resulting violent disturbances. Occasionally, 2 or more air cells combine. It is during this period that the texture of our finished cake is formed. This is the period of shrinkage. It is the critical period which determines whether a cake is a success or a failure. Marble cake illustrates our observation that cake batter moves during the baking process. The baker merely puts batters of different colors in the pan, but the marble design is made by the natural batter circulation during baking. The movement is regulated by the conduction of heat. The heated batter rises along the sides of the pan and flows along the top surface toward the center. This movement continues until the cake begins to set. The side and bottom crusts of the cake set during the early stages of the baking process, but the center portion will remain fluid for a longer period. Layer cakes, like marble cakes, also flow in a regulated direction during baking. Most layer cakes attain their maximum height in the oven just before reaching the period of high internal pressure. When it is time to remove them from the oven, there will have been some shrinkage and loss in size. This comes during the high pressure period. Correct batter structure helps avoid shrinkage. Not only must the structure be controlled, but it is also necessary to maintain an exact balance between the various ingredients. Good formula balance demands a proper ratio of sugar to liquid, of shortening to eggs, and flour to sugar. Flour, moisture, and eggs are known as tougheners. Sugar and shortening are tenderizers. When the weight of flour exceeds that of the sugar, the cake will be tough. Excessive amounts of eggs and milk also cause toughness. Let's make a tough cake batter, made tough purposely, by the addition of slightly too much eggs and flour. Micro-baking helps us to understand some of the difficulties caused by unbalanced formulas. As one would expect, batters which produce tough cakes show resistance to all normal cellular movement. Notice that the lack of mobility causes higher internal pressures within the baking cake. This leads to the formation of holes and tunnels. Only tough cakes show these defects. Tunnel formations caused by excessive pressure may be observed microscopically by the strained alternate pushing and pulling of the resistant batter, contrasted to the free movement of the normal batter. Here is a cake baked from the same tough batter, and it is tough. The crust is rubbery, and inside are large tunnels or holes that usually run vertically through the layer. Tough, dry cakes, of course, are not satisfactory. The remedy? More shortening and sugar. Incidentally, this trouble is often found in devil's food cakes. It can be overcome the same way, by using more tenderizers, particularly shortening. Cake formulas require a delicate sugar-moisture balance. The quantity of sugar should never exceed the combined weight of eggs and milk. But let's bake a batter that will produce a cake far too tender, made tender purposely by adding too much sugar. There is little structural difference between this batter and the normal batter before baking. But as soon as the fat melts, the air cells begin a too rapid movement through the entire mass. The liquid medium surrounding the cell offers such little resistance that too many cells combine during the early stages of baking. This combining of air spaces makes the cake framework highly dispersed and fragile. The cake begins to collapse as soon as the period of high internal pressure is reached. The homemaker blames cakes like this on heavy footsteps in the kitchen during baking. Now we know better. A cake too tender to support itself will fall or shrink of its own weight with no outside help. Our microscopic studies have shown the importance of shortening in the leavening of a cake. Now let's do some special micro-baking to see how shortening helps control cake texture and volume. Here is a batter with an insufficient amount of shortening. Movement is retarded because there is not enough fat present for proper lubrication, and the proportion of air to total batter weight is too small. The shortening can neither leaven sufficiently nor lubricate properly because there is just not enough shortening present. Conversely, here is a batter prepared to show the effect of too much shortening. This batter has 20% more shortening than is necessary. Note that, as usual, the shortening contains all of the air. As baking proceeds, there is an even distribution of pressure, contrasted to the high resistance of the batter containing too little shortening. Cells expand slowly and evenly with a freedom of movement that assures a smooth texture. Shortening tenderizes a cake and improves texture, but too much will reduce cake volume. Remember, the amount of the shortening should not exceed the weight of the eggs. Additional factors about shortening are revealed by microscopic study and micro-baking. One is creaming quality. A mixture of shortening and sugar, when partially creamed, looks like this under the microscope. Air cells are being entrapped by the shortening. The sharp edges of the sugar granules cleave the larger air cells into a series of smaller ones. Confectioner's sugar does not have sharp edges, therefore it does not cream nearly so rapidly as granulated sugar. This is the mixture after eggs have been added. The eggs have been creamed with the shortening and sugar. The fat has begun to disperse itself in the form of lakes. Remember, our previous study of batter structure showed the fat as the dispersed phase in cake batter. It is evident that this condition develops just as soon as liquid materials are added. Note how firmly the air cells are embedded in the red-colored shortening. A few crystals of undissolved sugar are present, but these will soon dissolve. A finished pound cake batter provides a most effective illustration of creaming quality. Here are 2 pound cake batters under the microscope. The batter on your left was made with a good creaming shortening. The one on your right with a poor shortening. Notice on your left the plentiful air cells in the good batter, each perfectly coated with shortening. Then on your right, the comparatively few air cells. 2 cakes have been baked from these batters, same weight, same amount of ingredients. Here are the 2 cakes, just a difference in creaming quality of the shortening used. Could more baking powder have helped the poor creaming shortening? Here is a batter made with a poor creaming shortening to which has been added a double amount of baking powder. At the beginning of the micro-baking process, it looked as if the baking powder might do the job. But notice that no new air cells are being created. Instead, the already existing air spaces are being so filled with gas that they collapse, producing a coarse crumb structure and a dry, crumbly cake. Good emulsifying properties in shortening are very important. For example, the bottle on your left contains a mixture of oil and water. On your right, the bottle contains the mixture plus an added emulsifying agent. The oil and water containing the emulsifying agent do not separate. The oil will remain dispersed in the water for a prolonged period. This same phenomenon is also common to cake batters. The batter on your left was made with a regular hydrogenated shortening which contained no emulsifying agent. This batter appears curdled. The batter on the right was made with an emulsifier-type shortening. It appears slick and non-viscous. Cakes baked from these two batters would differ greatly in volume, texture, and tenderness. Only slight differences in a shortening's ability to emulsify will make great differences in cake quality. Let's study cake batter emulsions more closely. This batter was made from regular hydrogenated shortening, but without the helpful emulsifying agent. Excessive cake shrinkage can be predicted because the fat lakes are much too large. Notice the size of the dispersed shortening lakes. Bakers would call such batters curdled. The microscope reveals a coarse emulsion of shortening in the liquid portion of the batter. There is plenty of air. The creaming quality of the shortening is good, but the emulsifying property will have to be improved before we have a satisfactory cake shortening. So let's examine batters made with shortenings of progressively improved emulsifying properties. This batter shows improvement over the preceding one. It will still appear curdled to the baker. It will not carry a heavy load of moisture and sugar. The size of the lakes of fat are somewhat smaller than before. Cakes made from it will be larger, but still not large enough. Now, this batter will make a fairly satisfactory layer cake, even at a high sugar level. It no longer appears curdled even to the eye. There are smaller-sized lakes of fat. As the fat distribution becomes finer, the total number of lakes becomes greater. A real improvement is noted in this batter, as evidenced by the still finer dispersion of shortening. The size of the lakes of shortening is just right. Notice how snugly the air is bound in each shortening particle. Flour particles are evident throughout the liquid medium. This is the normal batter we have already micro-baked for you. It produces the ideal cake. Batters made from shortening such as this are smooth and velvety. Finished cakes always have maximum volume and will not shrink. Extremely high percentages of liquid and sugar may be used with complete safety. Here is a series of white layer cakes made from the batters just examined microscopically. The shortening which produced the first batter, the one of coarsest fat dispersion, made a cake only 2.5 inches high. The cake is heavy and soggy. It is too tender for handling. The second shortening produced a 3-inch cake with slight improvement of texture. The third shortening, which brought the batter dispersion within the range required by the baker, produces a 3.25-inch cake with a firm, even texture. The best shortening, as our scientific experiments predicted, produced the best cake. It is 3.5 inches high. This represents a gain of 8% over the cake made from the next best batter, or one whole cake in 12. An increase of 17% in volume over the cake made from the second best batter, or a gain of 1 cake in 6. And an increase of 33% in volume over the cake made from the coarsest batter, or 1 extra cake in 3. Look Look at this fine layer cake. It has a feathery lightness, a velvety texture, and a smooth, melt-in-your-mouth palatability. It is entirely free from tunnels. The crumb structure is even and soft, yet this cake is sufficiently firm to allow proper handling and slicing. A perfect cake. Micro-baking offers a new and very promising approach to an understanding of many problems which have puzzled bakers for years. Such time-honored problems as holes in bread, puffless cream puffs, angel food collapse, dough streaks, all types of shrinkage are well within the scope of micro-baking research. The findings of our laboratory studies are available to you, for our work is designed to help the baker improve his products. Progress can be expected through the combined efforts of the laboratories of the shortening industry, the millers of flour, the yeast manufacturers, builders of machinery, and other laboratories, including several fine ones operated by bakers themselves. The neighborhood retail baker, alert to his everyday opportunities, takes commercial advantage of the research efforts being expended for his benefit. He skillfully applies the scientific information coming to him from many sources, for he knows that modern methods, when used in his everyday work, are his greatest assets in the competition with other foods for a place on the American table. In the large wholesale bakeries, too, the knowledge of the worker is supplemented by the skillful application of scientific methods. Micro-baking and other research in the science of baking will continue to be beneficial. But it should be remembered that it is the baker's skill and knowledge that determines the consistently fine quality of baked products. Thousands and thousands of cakes exactly alike, delicious, appealing to the eye on the outside and exceptionally high quality on the inside, all made without guesswork, made by today's modern, scientifically minded bakers. Mrs. America, as she does her daily shopping, may not be completely aware of the many reasons for the constant improvement in the quality of baked foods, but she is learning more and more to appreciate the advantages of the economy, convenience, and dependability offered by the baker.